Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Daniel Sayani, and we are going to be talking about whether mikvaos for taharas are a big scam. Rabbi Daniel Sayani has been involved in various aspects of the Chevra Kadisha and Jewish funerals for over 6 years. He has smicha from Machon Leman Yilmadu, which includes musmachim such as Nitei Gavriel and Harav David Shochet Tzitzal, Yeshivas Or Kedosha de Biyala, and from Machon Smicha, and is also a member of the Rabbinical Alliance of America. By pure coincidence, or hashgacha pratis, we just had Rabbi Gil student on, who I think is one of your allies in the alliance. I love the name. I feel like it's like from Star Wars or something. You know, you're like part of the alliance. Great branding on your end. And we are going to be looking at a tshuva of the Yaskil Avdi and contrasting it with the psakim of Rav Moshe Feinstein about whether a mikvah is required. So, Rabbi Sayani, maybe you want to, I think it's a little bit obvious from your bio, tell us, why you chose these tshuvos, maybe just familiarize our audience, with, in general, what happens at a Taharah, and what is the point of controversy over here we're going to be looking at today.
Fantastic. So, the Chevra Kadisha, the two main functions that we provide are Shmira, the act of watching or guarding over the deceased, and of course, Taharah, which we'll see in just a second is a bit of a loaded term. So what the procedure really consists of is three distinct processes, which collectively we refer to as a Taharah. The first is Rechitza washing, which is mentioned directly in the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah in Masechah Shabbos, the Chofnan Aleph on the base specifically talks about the practice of washing the deceased. In that instance, that we don't do it on Shabbos, but it does mention that there is a washing of the deceased. And this was done for purposes of Kavod HaMeis, and later sources like the Sefer Chassidim explain that we return somebody to Olam Haba in the same way that they came in, right? A person comes into the world by water clean. They leave the world in the same way. And the Rishonim speak very much at length about this and how it needs to be a thorough process. There's another tshuva of the Binyamin Zev where he says how thoroughly it needs to be done in the way a person prepares themselves in Erev Shabbos to go to shul, because we're preparing the mace for entering into Shabbos HaShabboson, sort of the Sabbath of Sabbaths of their existence, basically. And then the
Yom
component
Shekula
that
Shabbos Menucha.
Yes. And the part of this that we refer to as the Taharah is something that is shrouded in a bit more mystery, in the sense that it doesn't have a direct makor in any Torah Shabbal Peh or in any Rishonim, but it is something that emerged in popularity really around the time of the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And there's a book called Mavar Yabok that was published by Makobel in Italy. And Mavar Yabok is really the first to really put in print this idea that there should be a purification of really more of a metaphysical nature on top of a rechitza, a washing, a cleansing. And that is what we refer to as the Taharah itself. And the idea, and the Yaskil Avdi in the tshuva that we're going to see, he sort of explains some of the background of where this came from. But the short answer is that there is a belief, it's brought in the Shuri Knesset Hagadola actually, as well as the Tashbates. There's this belief that when the time of Yitzias Neshama occurs, there is a belief that that a nifter experiences some sort of a Balkari situation, that there is some emission, and this would cause the neshama embarrassment, and to sort of remove that, take it as literally as you may, but to sort of remove that or remedy that, there is a process of tahara.
Right. It really it raised my eyebrow. I was looking at the Lashon that the Yaskil Avdi, who you'll tell us who that is in a moment, quotes from the Tashbates. He says, "Lafi kishaneshama yotza mehaguf Roa pnei hashchina, he sees the face of the divine presence. Umachvas pachad poleta shichva zera, and he has the seminal emission. Umatames aguf, and therefore he's a balkari, as you said, needs to be purified. It's just like this. It's like a very odd. I mean, in general, I think in Hilchos Avelos, as you're pointing out already, many of the practices that we take for granted today don't have an earlier makor. And even for people, well, I guess we'll see, who may be more rationalist in nature or less Kabbalistic, it seems to have become normative practice. And I guess we'll see the Yaskil Avdi is going to adopt more of this Kabbalistic approach. And Ramosha Feinstein is going to push back with a more, he wasn't technically litvishe, but we'll call him the litvishe camp. So you want to tell us, yeah.
Yes.
Right. So who is the Yaskil Avdi? Because this is, I have to thank you. This is his debut on our podcast. Sorry, not his debut in literature, but for us, it's his debut.
Right. So, he's a very, the Yaskil Avdi, I think, is a very underappreciated Sephardi posek. It is really the only thing we have in the Shelos and Shuvas other than Rabbi Moshe that deal with this topic of mikvah for Taharah.
Oh, wow.
Right. It's sort of a very niche, concern. But just a little bit about the Yaskil Avdi. He's from Aram Sova. He's from Aleppo, and his mother was from the Labaton family. So he came into a Rabbanish family in Syria. The family moved to Yerushalayim in 1895, and as typical for many Syrian Sephardi, Talmidei Chachamim, he advanced not only in Shas and Poskim, but also delved into Nistar, to Kabbalah as well. And, that's really one of the unique things about him, was that he was a tremendous Makubal, as well as being, a very accomplished posek. He was Rosh Mesivta at Yeshiva Parat Yosef. And then he was also Rosh Yeshiva in the Yeshiva Beit El, which was, really one of the great centers of Kabbalah learning in Yerushalayim. And in 1951, he was named to the Beit Din Agadol, the Yerurim, the supreme Beit Din of the Rabbanut. So he sort of had a foothold in both the Rabbanut as well as in the Sephardi part of the Badatz back then, which was quite interesting.
Oh.
And he wrote 8 volumes of Teshuvot, right? There are 8 volumes of Yaskil Avdi. And he wrote many works on Kabbalah as well.
Wow. And so, and it's really, sorry, you're finishing his bio.
Yeah. And I was going to say, he was nifter in 1969.
Okay. During the Woodstock. One had nothing to do with the other, I'm sure. But anyway, so what's interesting is you're right. He's getting these shilos from Tzfas and from Tveria, Tzfas in particular, about the Arizal's mikvah, and people were lining up in droves to, well, I guess they were dead at that point, but their families were lining up in droves to make sure that they could go and be dipped in the mikvah there. And especially given the fact that some of them were very makbid on going to mikvah during their lifetime. And I think he even writes, he says that there are those who specifically move to Tzfas so that they can use the mikveh there. And ukabal bi'adin mikama gadol tzadikim she'achar sharido some mikvah hayu tovlim ba'atzmam. So I don't know if I read that line correctly, but it sounds like, is he saying what I think he's saying? He's saying, like, after they dipped the tzaddikim in there, they then were resuscitated and came back to life briefly so they could go to the mikvah themselves and then die again. I'm not sure if I read that line correctly, but given the fact there's a lot of Kabbalah in here, I think that's what he's saying.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Generally he's saying, yes. Yes. Wow. This is a very esoteric shuv. If you're into that kind of thing, then the Yaskil Avdi would be right up your alley, because this approach is used with many other things, many other shuvas that he deals with. So we're dealing with a situation where, where in these cities, people definitely had men that were alive. And this is really, I think, what the core of the question is. If a man in life is makpid on going to the mikveh, what should we do when they're nifter for their Taharah? Now, I think just, a bit of background maybe for the viewers with this, right? The Gemara in Maseches Brachos, Tav Chav Beis Amud Beis, talks about this practice of Tevilas Ezra, right? A man who has a seminal emission, It was a takana from Ezra HaSofer that they need to, that they need to be metaher themselves. And the halacha is that they become pure by tisha kavim, 9 kavim of water, which all of the Svarim on Taharas say that this is the equivalent of 24 Polish quarts of water. And, really a person could stand under a shower. Technically, you stand under a shower for a requisite, time period.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes effectuated, right? The Tisha Kavim will pour out from just standing under a shower, and we'll see really that is really the older, more established practice when you do a tahara, is that you pour these Tisha Kavim. The practice lemaisa is that it gets poured from no more than 3 buckets in a continuous process. There can't be a hefsek. Now, the core of the issue is people that did more than that, people that sort of, wanted to be marba kedusha or whatever, who did more than this by actually going in a mikveh. What do we do when they pass? And the practice in Sfat actually was, and in Tiberia, was that they would put a nifter and Sfat in the mikveh of the Arizal, which were a mayan. They were spring waters. And in Tiberia, they would use the Kinneret, it says in the Tshuva. And they had an easy opportunity, it says, to toivel the mesim in these waters. Whereas in Yerushalayim, people that used the mikveh, it says that it was a standard mikveh from rainwater. And they would have to drain the mikveh out after the Taharah, which was not efficient because they had water shortages. So the Shoel in this case, Rav Avram Leib Zilberman, who was the Abbezdin in Sfas, he's asking the Yaskil Avdi really what the source for it is. Why would this be done? Because it was unknown to him why people would have this hakpad in the Tahara process. And he's also asking really, should it be done?
Right, and you mentioned the reason for a balkari. That's one concern. The other, I think he mentions in Ospays of his tshuva, he says, so basically, we're gonna give him a tvila in this world, so he doesn't need to be purged in Gehenna after his passing. Which is, it's funny because we assume that after someone dies, there's a lot of assumptions here that we can still do something to benefit them. Okay, there's some makoros, depending, we could ask who can do it. Is it only a child? Other people, great. But that mikvah is going to help. I don't know if are they getting schar when you put tzitzis on them also? What's going on over here?
Yes, that's a great point. So in no space, he actually quotes one of his Kabbalistic drushes, Vayikach Avdiyahu, and he says that this sort of realm in Olam Haba that we would call in an English river of light, they can't toivel when they're there, so we do it here. And this ties in actually, though, to something broader. That's sort of a theme that you see throughout the entire process, which is that there is really a view that what we're doing, in a sense, is helping the neshama. And many of the things that we do to help the neshama are very reminiscent of what we would do. Of course, the rechitz is like what we would do on Erev Shabbos, the way we prepare ourselves to go into Shabbos, by fixing our hair and cutting our nails. Although nowadays we clean under the nails, and we have all of that brought in the Binyan Sev and the Darchei Moshe. That's another source that really deals with this authoritatively. But there is this idea that the things that the Chevra Kaddish will do for a nifter, it's like we're really preparing them for their own personal Yom Hadin. He makes mention here that we do this, that those who do the Tevila, they would do it in order to save him from the severe punishment of these immersions in fire that would occur in those levels of Gehenna. And he says that this is according to what certain Hasidim even do. There were even non-Hasidish Gedolim that requested that in their Taharah they would have, sort of an enactment of the Arba Misos Bezdin.
Wow.
And in the same way, there are many people where on Erev Yom Kippur, they'll take like a gartel and the Malkus, and they'll do that reenactment on Erev Yom Kippur, even as a preparation. And of course, the major preparation of Yom Kippur is going in a mikveh, is toiveling in a mikveh. And the Gaonim even question, should a bracha be made on such a practice?
Wow.
So, it's something with such chashivus that there even is an idea that maybe it is a bit more than a minhag.
Hey, look, it seems like a fair trade-off to me, like get a dip in the mikvah versus a dip in the flames of Gehenna. I mean,
Right.
seems like a fair
Yeah.
trade-off. Maybe so right. So when you frame it that way, it could be understood why it's not just these obscure makubalim who are advocating for it, but you can imagine even the Hamon Am, the average person, when they hear, oh, I could avoid burning in Gehenna if I just get dipped in the mikvah after I die.
Right.
Okay, my state will pay for the extra costs that go into that. But it seems Rav Moshe Feinstein did not buy into this. Do you want to talk about the contrast between Yaskil Avdi and the Igros Moshe?
Sure. So, um, Reb Moshe is exemplifying really more of, the litvishe approach, we could call it, even though he technically wasn't litvish. Um, it is more of the litvishe approach, which is more grounded, really not so much in Kabbalistic thinking at all, but more so in really a straightforward read of what Tevilas Ezra is. Now, the interesting thing about that is, we're taking a concept that is which many people, of course, would say this is esoteric and metaphysical enough, right? A person is nifter. What could be more tameh than that? But Reb Moshe accepts it as just this is the minhag. This is sort of the widespread minhag of the Jewish people that Marva Yabok sort of introduces. That and again, as we see in the Yaskil Avdi, he cites the Shari Knesset Hagadola, who talks about this fear that the nifter faces, and they become a Balkari as a process. Now, obviously, many people are nifter where that physically can happen, right? And so Mavriya book sort of makes a low plug between men and women and children and men who physically can't experience that. So it is perhaps to be interpreted, in a Lavdavka way. But Reb Moshe really sticks with that approach. And there is a broader tradition that comes before Reb Moshe, which emphasizes that you do Tisha Kavim. This is what the Gemara says. The Gemara says for a Balkari, he becomes Tahor by pouring Tisha Kavim. There's no mention of him needing an actual mikveh, a kosher mikveh for Noshim, let's say. The straightforward approach is that Tisha Kavim is sufficient for somebody in that state of being a Balkari. Before Reb Moshe, take the Aruch HaShulchan, for instance. The Aruch HaShulchan, the one sort of area in Yoredeya where this is referred to, the Aruch HaShulchan says clearly, V'shochim alav tisha kavim me'umad. And the Chochmas Adam is really the other Achron, litvishe Achron, who deals with the set length, right? In the Chochmas Adam, there is an entire section on Hanhagos Kever Kedisha, Kuntras Matsevos Moshe. He also says that this is the way to do it, that you pour Tisha Kavim, ideally with the nifter being lifted upright. And there are chevers even nowadays that do it in that litvish way, that they see it as something that our achronim say you do it this way, so you do it this way. You don't add on, sort of the extraneous in their view things that the Yaskil Avdi was asked about. So Reb Moshe,
and if I may,
yeah,
there was one line that really just stuck out to me. I'm looking back at Igros Moshe. I double underline this one. He says, "Ki be'etzem b'meisim chafshi." He makes that point that you and I were probably raising our eyebrows when we read the Yaskil Avdi, which is they're already dead. There's nothing more you can do for them. You're gonna say that there's this minhag of Tisha Kavin, so maybe you should make a kava chomer. So he says that the ein lamdim mitisha kavin shekol shekain b'mikvah adif, because you would think, if 9 kavin helps him, kol shekain certainly if I dip him in the mikvah. To ein lamdim in yom elu de kabbalah make kava chomer. This isn't halacha. This is Kabbalah. We don't know the reason for 9 kavin, but we have a tradition. There are greater people in us who've established it. We follow that tradition. But who are we to start, playing around with that? This isn't like halacha where, simple logic can dictate something.
Yes, simple logic cannot dictate it. He says explicitly, that the musig of kal v'chomer, it's a matter of halacha, and we don't extrapolate, svaras, right? We don't get involved with making svaras with things that come to us in in a way that comes from possibly an origin in Kabbalah.
Right, and
But
he says it's
yeah,
hubris. He says v'prach doors lo adif mi doors hakodmim shahayu gedolim v'tovim men lo nagu bazeh. Like think about all those earlier generations of gedolim who are not doing this, and we have the hubris to say that we're holier than them. Or I guess you could put it the other way. Honestly, if I were to push back, I could say maybe we're just in such a low madrega. We need the mikvah to get us onto the level of the the gedolei rishonim who preceded us. Maybe that's a charitable read of it. I don't know.
so what's very interesting is that you know, Rav Moshe's contemporary, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal, he explicitly gave orders that there should not be a mikveh used by his Taharah. There's a book
Oh
written by
wow.
Rav Moshe Epstein Zatzal, Taharah Manual of Practices. He was a Talmud of Rav Moshe, and there's sort of a lot of Torah Shabbal Peh from Rav Moshe that he puts in this book. And he brings that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal Dafka did not want a mikveh to be used. The other interesting thing is that one of the other big svarim that we use in Chevra Kadisha, the Gesher Chachayim,
Ah,
he establishes actually in Eretz Yisrael that the mikveh should be the standard. It's very interesting.
really?
He holds really like the Yaskil Avdi. He says that, not only is there nothing wrong with the mikveh, but he saw that as preferably what should be used in Eretz Yisrael.
So if you're
However,
willing
in
to,
his,
if you're going to end your
yeah,
fast early by Rav Tukachinsky standards, the author of Gesher
yeah,
Chaim, then you also have to get dipped in the mikveh at the end of life. But if you wait a few minutes longer for Rav Moshe, then you could suffice
yeah.
with the Tisha Kavod, right? Is that how it's
And
supposed to play out? I don't know if people do
yeah,
that consistently.
right. The interesting thing is that in his Zavah, he requested that the Tahara be done in the litvishe way. He
Huh,
wanted a Reb Moshe Chochmas Adam Aruch HaShulchan Tahara. He
wow.
requested that the Tahara be done with the Chevra standing him upright and pouring Tisha Kavim over him. That was actually that was his wishes. He
Hmm,
didn't. So even so he establishes a standard of what he feels should be done in Eretz Yisrael for himself. Maybe on some level, he felt that Reb Moshe was, more correct because, in this shuva he says explicitly, Reb Moshe, that this idea of using a mikveh, it's not found even in the Mavar Yabok, which is slightly kabbalistic, but he says that there's no mention of this in any Rishonim. You know, even in early Achronim, and Rebosh is typically not big on being Saimach on other Achronim, but
hmm.
he's saying here that there's really no there's really no textual origin for it. That it all comes from it all comes from the basis of what we see the Shoel and the Yaskil Avdi referring to in these
Definitely.
sort of ideas, and more so than that, you know there is another broader there's a broader so I would say that this is one sort of broad methodological concern Reb Moshe has, that he sees Tahara not just as a folk religious thing, but it is something that Reb Moshe views that this is a serious halachic thing. The idea that a nifter needs to be washed, this has a basis, was going far back as the Mishnah. So he sees it in such a way that there is a kedusha to it, there is a cheshivas to it, and it should be kept as close to that intention of Chazal and the Rishonim as possible.
I
And
think
he
that's an
makes this,
important point that you make, which is it's Ramosha's approach is not coming from a lack of deference to tradition. Rather, it's because he holds our tradition in such high regard. He says, "Who are we to start innovating things in the last few
yes,
hundred years? We have to do things based on what Chazal and our earliest authorities tell us." So that's a very important point, which is the halachic and also the theological elements. Though, as our session is drawing to a close, I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on what I think is perhaps the most exciting and instructive point of this for the Hamonah, for people like myself, which is the economic and moral
oh
point that Rav
yes,
Moshe makes.
exactly where I
So
was
I'd
going to
love for
get
you
the
to talk
parsha
about that.
Kavati. Sure. So, one of the things that even unlearned Jews are aware of is sort of this idea of a plain pine box, right? Even Jews that aren't so connected yet to the tradition understand the Takana of Rabban Gamliel, right? The Gemara in Maseches Kesubos Tav Ches Amud Aleph, and this is what Reb Moshe brings, right? Rabban Gamliel was misakein that people should be buried simply in plain linen tachrichim, because people in those days very often would get caught up in spending unnecessary money on fancy tachrichim made of silk and different things, and people would abandon their deceased. They wouldn't bury their loved ones out of economic concerns. And so from this is a klal in the Gemara that we try to be as sensitive to economic concerns of the chayim of the living as possible, but also, you know, the intention of that takana is that we treat everybody the same in death. And Reb Moshe is very put off by this idea that if a person was so from that the man went to the mikveh every day, he should get a mikveh when he passes. Reb Moshe had a very big problem with that based on this reading of the Gemara, that really every Jew should receive the same Taharah, that we don't make differences and tikkunim and enhancements in the Taharah process from one Jew to the next. And most chavras, at least, are very careful that every Jew gets the same Taharah. And the economic element, this is the basis for why, we do bury people in a simple aron in America and in Chutz La'aretz, where we bury in an aron. Simplicity, keeping costs down, is in line with this takana of Rabbi Gamliel. And Reb Moshe's concern was that if people start insisting on a mikveh, and he even transliterates the word chapels.
Yeah, I love that.
He talks about yeah, I love that, right? Chapels, you get chapels to build a mikveh, they're going to raise their costs. And Reb Moshe he was very concerned about that. The chapel in question that he's talking about, by the way, is Parkside on Queens Boulevard,
Oh, wow.
Oliver Shalom, which no longer exists. But
it doesn't even say that in the tshuva. You figured it out on your own.
I know that from Rabbi Zone. I've heard Rabbi Zone say that this is referring to Parkside.
Wow.
But the concern was that that if we start insisting that a mikveh be built, a kosher mikveh, it's going to really boost costs tremendously, and that becomes a problem. It's at odds with this takana of Rabban Gamliel.
Right. So there is this economic and I would say even a moral point that Ramosh is making, which is Rabbi Gamliel was misaking, right? We're not talking just a minhag from a few hundred years ago in an obscure halachic, Kabbalistic source. We're going all the way back to Rabbi Gamliel himself, who said that everyone should be able to afford a funeral. People shouldn't be flaunting their wealth at it. It's not about affluence. And here we are now trying to make all these hidurim, which, ostensibly looks very religious, but actually now that's going to become the standard. That's going to become the Glock kosher is going to become the standard for everybody now. And then people are going to struggle to afford what they think is the baseline when in fact that's not the truth. And I guess I would just reflect on this. It's almost a shame that this argument would only be made. I'm sure if Moshe would, maybe there is a tshuva I'm not aware of. We could apply this to weddings. We could apply this to living standards in the Jewish community in general. You look at all we thought and we prayed and we hoped after COVID, people would learn that we don't need all of these huge fancy weddings anymore, that, you have to take out of your 401k to afford to marry off your kid. But I don't think it's lasted. So it's a shame that this argument would only apply to the end of life. It should apply throughout our lives as well.
Absolutely. And the other interesting thing is, the way, and not to go on a tangent, the way the funeral business works practically is that you have corporate-owned chapels and you have, privately family-owned chapels, many of which are owned by frum Jews in Brooklyn and different places. And, we do have many communities where they go to a corporate chapel when you have an alternative owned by a Jewish family or even a non-Jewish family that wants to accommodate Jewish practice. The price is sometimes 50, 60% less. So, I think to have a broader conversation about the economics of end of life, or even how we approach simchas within life, that is sort of a broader issue that this alludes to, definitely.
100%. And is there, just anything else that it's I'm very appreciative, Rabbi Sayani, of having you on. I think you're our first expert in terms of, just dealing with taharas and funerals. And I appreciate us getting to diversify our portfolio, talking about hilchos, avelos and mikvos here. And is there anything else you want our listeners to kind of just know about this industry, as you call it, about, they have big pharma, so I guess we call it big funeral?
Yes. So, if there's one thing that became a passion of mine, the way that I got very passionate about this and learning about it was that I was once doing shmir in a funeral home in Monmouth County, New Jersey. I saw two people go into the Taharah room to do a Taharah, and they were out in 15 minutes. And it was very clear that they really weren't doing the proper thing. So I educated myself. And I learned that unfortunately there are many people doing this that are motivated economically, and as such, it doesn't get done properly. Baruch Hashem, many communities, Stamford, Westchester, Clifton, all the shuls in Teaneck and Manhattan, different places. We have many chavras that they send for people. They're thorough. They really love what they're doing. They're doing it l'shem mitzvah.
I'm sure the place you mentioned has improved since then.
And unfortunately, in many communities, they rely on a paid chevra kadisha where the job doesn't really get done to that level. And I think people need to be aware, especially Rabbanim, need to be aware of what goes on behind closed scenes. We can't rely on people because they sound frum. We need to see how these things are being done. We need to take it seriously. We take kashrus very seriously, as we should. And my mission is to really get Rabbanim to think seriously about halachic standards in Taharah and Shmira to ensure that things are being done kedas v'din. And we need to really see it, as Rabbi Moshe did, as a very important halachic issue, not just some minhag that is disposable or could be done away with. That this is very important. That this is the very important Masorah of Klal Yisrael, going all the way back to the days of Rabbi Gamliel and even before. So my closing word would be that I want consumers to become aware of the issues, and I especially want Rabbanim of all stripes to know what's going on in their communities, especially out of town in Manhattan, in places like that where there might be a lack of oversight. And also one concluding point, just to conclude this on a Lamaisa note, right? What do we do Lamaisa? I think is, on our Shiloh, what we do Lamaisa is a very interesting thing to look at. So what I see typically is that, people like the Yaskil Avdi's community, right, the Syrian community, they just opened up a beautiful chapel in Long Branch in Deal. They have a beautiful mikveh there. So typically, many Sfardim, as well as most Hasidim, will use the mikveh, which makes sense given the preeminence of Kabbalah in those traditions. Most other chevras, from what I see, do use tishakavim, although sometimes a mikveh will be used, because sometimes use of the mikveh may be easier than doing it, in a manner that's me'umad. The bottom line is that we want to do whatever is best for kavod hameis. People will look at it from different sides. What ends up being more respectful to the mace, right? That could become a very subjective thing, right? Reb Moshe Heinemann, for instance, brought in Taharah manual of practices. He holds that a mikveh is not really respectful just because of the mechanics of how it operates. But I think deep down he also sees it as really not being in line with, the litvishe approach or the textual approach of achronim that we've received. So, my personal preference, if I were to say one, would be tishakavim. I think textually it does have more of a firm basis. I would defer to Reb Moshe Heinemann and Reb Moshe Shita on that. But, Reb Moshe even says that, even concludes one of the chuvas by saying, if you have a family where they really feel that this is what their father would want, let's say, we don't protest it. We let people do it if it kind of makes them feel better. If it makes
he also says, "Ein livnos mikvos b'bati halavayos." You shouldn't go out of your way to make the mikvos, but someone who's roy for it, yimsu mikvah mishik far asa. Find one that was already made, but this shouldn't be the new culture.
It shouldn't be the new culture. And also, in the vast majority of funeral homes, with very few exceptions, if they do say they have a mikveh, it's not a kosher mikveh. It's mayim shiuv, and it's like a bathtub, basically. So, let's keep that in mind. If it's not even really a kosher mikveh, it's a mikveh that would be roy for a man to, satisfy tefillas Ezra in, but it could just easily be done by tishakavim, which is the point that Reb Moshe makes.
Absolutely. Well, Rabbi Sayani, I really appreciate you bringing your expertise and also the moral message at the end as a person who's working in the pulpit. You have encouraged me to maybe have a better understanding of these inyanim, not just outsourcing it. And I think this is the beginning of that discussion. And I think our listeners enjoyed this as well. Thank you so much. Hashem should give you continued hatzlacha in your very important work that you're doing.
Amen. Thank you so much for having me. Kol tov.
Kol tov.